political and institutional messaging assumes that if people don't agree, they just don't have enough information. But from your experience, why is behavior change almost never an information problem?
I first discovered this way back. It was 2006, and I was working in a London borough called Barking and Dagenham, which is a big kind of working class suburb of London, and they elected 12 British National Party councillors. British National Party is a fascist party, absolutely explicitly. I'm not over-egging that.
Yeah, that's right.
And we were brought in to look at why this had happened and what could be done to address the threats, the genuine jeopardy that the prospect of a London borough, which is a population of about 300,000, actually electing a fascist-run council. And we did lots of research, talking to people and trying to understand why they had chosen to do this. And we started off with the presumption that what we needed to do was what is colloquially known here as myth busting, that it must be that they'd got the wrong end of the stick. They didn't know what they didn't really know what they were doing. It's just a case of giving them the right information and explaining it, and then the problem would go away. And it not only did it not go away, but that approach exacerbated the problem and made it worse, because we were implicitly calling people stupid because they had chosen to do, and they knew what they were doing, and what they were doing was expressing a deep sense of insecurity, a profound narrative of loss. They were mourning the traditional working class community where people looked after each other, and they felt that was being threatened. Their identity was being threatened, and so we realised right from then that we needed to get into rapport with people to earn the right to be heard. It wasn't a case of spouting information or telling them they were wrong or mad or bad. It was actually the first order of the day was to make sure we listened. And so, listening often, the forgotten half of communication was completely forgotten then. So that's a rather long-winded answer, but that's kind of where it started for me. And then over the years, I've learned. I'm still learning every day about this thing. How can we better understand what drives, what motivates people?
I learned an awful lot from you, David, when we had lunch, and we were talking about the rise of the sort of extreme movements, and people drawn increasingly to these populist movements, and a lot of people sort of dismissing them as they're misinformed or irrational or looking down upon them. That happened obviously in the US when you had Hillary Clinton, who sort of referred to people as deplorables. That happened, some would argue, the sort of liberal elite here in London, in Islington, sort of, looking down upon working class voters for voting far left or far right. And what was really interesting is David really helped me sort of understand that actually you've got to have compassion and empathy and understand that sometimes people are fearful. Sometimes there is an issue that is a signal of unmet psychological needs. And I wanted, David, you to share that with Doug and our listeners, the insight that you gave me.
Sure. My erstwhile colleague, John McTernan, who is a very good analyst, if you come across his work, he worked in Number 10 for when Tony Blair was Prime Minister. John said that all politics is Maslowian, and I agree with him that Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which just in very simple terms states that your first need, you need to feel safe and secure, and unless you can feel safe and secure, you can't aspire. You can't aspire. And unless you can aspire, you can't learn more about yourself and strive towards a benevolent society. That's very, very crude shorthand for what we found was that many people, for a variety of reasons, and it's not just as simple as economic sort of poverty or social class. It's more complex than that. But the poorer you are, clearly, the more likely you are to feel unsafe and insecure. And if you can think to the last time you felt genuinely unsafe, it physically locks the brain down. You're in fight or flight mode. The parts of the brain that kind of take in information are locked down for very good reasons. And this is where I think communicators and professionals in politics, but also, you know, in any role, we often just make the mistake of not really reaching out and understanding where people are and what is their unmet psychological need, and finding that as the basis, not to change our message or values or principles, but understand that we need to frame things in a way that will be received by somebody where they are. I think Einstein was misquoted as saying, when the facts don't fit our story, we change the facts. But that's what we all do. And if our story of the world and what's happening to us and why it's happening, if that principal unmet psychological need for me at the moment happens to be feeling unsafe, that will create a prism through which I will see the world. And if you start to communicate with me about, let's create a benevolent society, I will tell you to get lost, because it doesn't fit my story, how I'm feeling. And so in politics, it's a case of understanding, first of all, and really devoting a lot to understanding what that frame is, and then taking care to build that trust rapport by respecting that. And respect is the word. So often, Farzana, I mean, you mentioned it, the deplorables, and we have made just as big a mistakes this side of the Atlantic too. And we absolutely mustn't. It's the road to ruin politically if you do that.
David, I love everything you just said. Fits perfectly. But David, you work in politics. Aren't politicians the ones pushing the insecurity and the fear?
Yeah, politics is a fight. It's a fight.
Yeah.
And I, at the moment, there's great jeopardy, I think, to mainstream politics, which is where I stand, and to our democracy. I'm somewhat hesitant to use the word populist in terms of populist right, populist left. I think that word almost takes us into a place where we're kind of we're being pejorative about anyone who might be taken in by a populist, what might be described as a populist line. When I think we have to take it on the chin, the mainstream. If people are choosing to go for other parties than our own, the first responsibility is on us. It's not on the voters. The voters are always right, and so we need to really get that. But yeah, politics is one of the few disciplines where things are weaponized, where your opponents can explicitly say, "I want to do you in," and so you have to learn to operate under fire, not literal fire, but political fire. And in those circumstances, there are atrocities and excesses committed that I think degrade and contribute to the corrosion of trust. And there's lots of evidence to show that decline in trust. People now are in the UK are certainly far less likely to always vote for the same party. And again, we've just got to take that on the chin. We can't moan about that. We've created it by losing the connection with people, and we need to get it back.
David, as we were discussing earlier about psychological safety and how people who have who are from low-income backgrounds, they suffer more in terms of the lack of psychological safety. What about the information environment that we're now operating in? So when I was growing up in the UK, we had a couple of broadcast, media. We had a few sort of newspapers, and now all of a sudden everything's completely changed. And my daughter's got all these, TikTok and Snapchat, and I myself am swimming around in the social media sort of bubbles, and I feel myself before I go to bed, I don't want to watch the news. I don't want to actually even go on social media because it interrupts my sleeping. And it just made me think, do you think that this new information sort of ecosystem that we're now in contributes to that fight or flight mode where we're feeling psychologically insecure because of the way the algorithms are, and they favor extreme content, and then all of a sudden you lose perspective?
I absolutely agree. I think they pour petrol on it, and they get that insecurity in a way that maybe you rightly point out that mainstream politicians don't. There's a live debate at the moment in the UK about banning social media for under 16. So I went back to spoke at my old school 2 weeks ago, and they just had a debate in the school where they'd carried a motion to agree with the banning of social media for under 16s. And so this is kids
Wow, I'm
voting.
surprised.
But yeah, the motion carried. And I certainly feel that, if I think back to my younger self, God, it was difficult enough. It felt like a zoo, me trying to find myself and worried about what, my mates thought about me, your girls thought about me, without social media. God, I can't imagine how I'd have coped, growing up. And I think it's, I agree. I think we have to be careful about, sort of blaming too much on misinformation, because it can imply that, there's gullible, stupid people believing that, when actually we're capable of being just as gullible and stupid as they are. And so this kind of insight and awareness is self-awareness as well, about how flaws, and how I've got a prism through which I see the world, which is not true. When I'm not sure if this will work, but when I introduce people and take people round, and Farzana and I met here, Doug, you'd be most welcome if you come here. But I always tell them the story of Big Ben. I hope you can see that.
I've never heard
the Big
the story.
Ben, famous. And I ask people to look at the clock face and tell me what's wrong with it. And people stare at it and they can't tell me what's wrong with it. What's wrong with it is that when the Palace of Westminster burnt down in 1834, it was redesigned by somebody called Augustus Pugin, who was a rather zealous Catholic convert. And for Augustus Pugin, the character X was a sign of the devil. So no clock anywhere in the Palace of Westminster has, and they're all Roman numeral clocks, none of them have an X. So if you may have seen Big Ben over the years, if you look at 9, 10, 11 and 12, you will see that there is no X, but a funny little F symbol.
Yes.
So I've all my life have been looking at Big Ben thinking I've been seeing it, and I haven't been seeing it.
Right in front of my face. And I don't want to torture that story, but the point being that we filter out and we all make shortcuts because we're basically hardwired to be running around the forest hunter-gathering, and we're dealing with 35,000 messages or whatever it is every single day, getting faster and faster and faster, and we have to make shortcuts, and those shortcuts create our bias, our prejudice, and that's what we're contending with. And I would just say, in politics, people are more motivated, and this might be a distinction between conventional marketing and politics, but people are more motivated by what they're against than by what they're for. And so that plays into like algorithms and whatever. If you're stoking somebody's hatred or dislike of something, and there's a
very good author, David Runciman, academic, who's done a lot of work on motivation. And he posits, and this is really useful, it marries with the values idea as well, that people have two basic forms of motivation. Instrumental motivation, where you do something because it will lead to something else. And that's what most politicians' framework. Okay, I'm sitting here in the House of Lords, I will vote for this and it will make this happen. But there's another form of motivation which is particularly prevalent, particularly for people who are feeling insecure and unhappy, and that is expressive motivation, where you do something because it makes you feel better. And in politics, in marketing, I would contend, you have to speak to both forms of motivation, because if you say, vote Labour because we will, we will improve the National Health Service. That speaks to an instrumentally motivated person, but it doesn't speak to somebody who's just wants to stick one on the man, and maybe some other, I'm going to use the word populist, but I haven't come up with a better word, but they're good storytellers. They speak to that. They get it. I know I see how you feel. I feel like that too. I will. So the challenge for us is not to say don't feel like that or you're stupid to feel like that, but say I get it, I understand that, and let's fix it. That's the way in.
It is cathartic that if you're feeling a certain way and then someone that you perceive who's in power of a political party says, hey, I get you, I feel the same way, and they use rage as a propellant, then it is cathartic for the other people. And I totally get that. What do you think about that, Doug?
Yeah, I'm thinking of John McCain when he was running against Barack Obama, and someone in his audience had all these, he's a Muslim and I think he's a terrorist and all that. McCain snatched the microphone out of her hand and said, no, he's a good man. We just disagree on some certain things. That's a viral clip now. He lost the election. Yeah. He lost the election. So maybe there's a lesson there. But it's the humanity that you're talking about, David. That's what we want politicians to do. We don't want you to fight as much, right? Make your point, but not everything is the devil. Not everything is an X.
No, absolutely. It's about finding that common cause that is what
common values.
So what we're striving to do. The values of the Venn diagram, the values will overlap and joining, and there are others that thrive on dividing and making raw the differences rather than bringing together. And that sounds a bit kind of glib, motherhood and apple pie, but I'm reminded by your that quotation as my former counterpart in Denmark, Lasse Ryberg, who's just about next week they're having a general election in Denmark, which will be interesting. But Lasse Ryberg said, using Michelle Obama's quotes, "When they go low, we go relevant." And I think that is, that's certainly, I've kept quoting that, re-quoting that, because it's not, when they go low, we've got to understand, we've got to get thick with it. We've got to get closer to people, not further away from them. And that can be an uncomfortable place for, liberal, centre-left, if people are saying, right, there are too many immigrants in my country. And all of a sudden you think, oh, I can't think that. Oh, why do you've got to find ways of getting right. What's driving that? Insecurity, lack of safety.
Yeah.
Right.
You're saying don't attack each other as much for speaking out about what's in our heart.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's got to be, okay, I understand that.
Right.
And tackle that lack of safety, knowing that is the driver for it. And so that's the challenge.
David, thank you so much. It's wonderful spending time with you today.
Great pleasure.
Thank you for your